In this video, we're going to learn how to begin to solo over a progression that goes unresolved to resolved. So in our last video, we talked about the chords that are unresolved and resolved in relation to G Ionian. So the 2, 4, 5, and 7 chords are unresolved to G major 7. The 1, 3, and 6 chords are resolved. What we're going to do today is set up a 4-bar progression to solo over. And it's going to be a 2-5-1 progression, which means A minor 7, D7, and G major 7 for 2 bars. So 1 bar on the A minor 7, 1 bar on the D7, 2 bars on the G major 7. So what we have here is 2 bars of unresolved G Ionian. Remember, it's the C note in the A minor 7 and the C note in the D7 chord that are making them be unresolved to the G major. So A minor 7 for 1 bar, D7 for 1 bar, G major 7 for 2 bars, and we're going to keep repeating that. And I'm going to give you several solo ideas to use over this. Spend the time you need on each one of these steps before you move on to the next solo idea. I'm going to go through these relatively quickly so I can try and fit them all in. So the progression is 2 bars of unresolved Ionian and 2 bars of resolved Ionian. When you solo over a progression like this, you have a choice. You can follow the movement that the chords are creating, or you can not follow the movement that the chords are creating. The easiest thing to do is to not follow the movement. And the way you do that is by playing off of the resolved chord in the progression. And in fact, this is what you hear most rock players doing. If they're playing over a chord progression, which usually they are, they're usually picking one chord to play off of. So there's nothing wrong with doing that, but that's going to give us our simplest type of harmonic idea. So we'll develop this further as we go. But the first thing we're going to do is pick an idea that does not use the C note at all. And we're going to use that to solo over the entire progression. So what you're going to hear is, and the idea that we're going to use is G pentatonic, G major pentatonic. When I play that, right, no matter where I do that, that's going to avoid the C note. So there will be no C note in the solo, even though the chords, the first 2 measures of the chords, do have the C note in it. So the chords are going to, you're going to hear movement and rest. The solo is going to sound like it stays in the same place because we are not using the C note at all. So here's G pentatonic, just very shortly, quick demo of this, and then we'll come back and talk about the other ideas. So the solo is sounding like it's in one place. Even though the chords are moving. Okay, so make sure you listen to that as an idea up and down the neck. Second solo idea. Now, bear with me on this. This is going to sound a little silly at first, but I really want you to do this. Remember, this entire thing that we're talking about, resolved and unresolved Ionian, hinges on this one note, the C note. So what you're going to do first is, for this next solo idea, you're going to play nothing but the C note for the first 2 measures. Okay, so it's going to sound very simplistic. But the idea is to be very clear on what's going to start creating this movement as we move through these different solo ideas. It's really this one note being resolved down to the B or up to the D when we get to the G major. So over A minor 7 to D7, you're going to play one note, C. And when you move to the B or the D when we get to the G major 7, you're going to hear movement. Again, this is going to be very simplistic sounding, but it's kind of critical to the idea that we're talking about. We'll build on this as we go. So here's the same thing again. I'm just going to do this on a couple of different C's so you get the idea here, but it's pretty simple. I want you to do it on all of the C's, not just one C. Harmonically, that's all that's happening in this progression. So do that everywhere. Alright, very simplistic, but important to make sure you're clear on that. After you've done that, we're going to start adding notes to the C note. So for the first two measures, play the C note. And for now, what we're going to do is, I really want you to be on this C note in the last couple of beats of the second measure so that you can, the first beat that the G major 7 comes around, you can resolve that. We'll change that around a little bit later. But for now, that's what you should do. So we're going to play the C note. You can add a couple other notes. It doesn't matter what they are. And then come back to the C note and resolve it over the G. This is just to give us a little bit more interest in what's happening. All right, so here's that. All right, so I resolved it on the first beat. So I'm playing very, very simply. I'm not trying to make this sound complicated. All right? You can get some decent sounding ideas going just with that. All right, so now we're going to build on that a little bit further. We're going to choose an idea that includes this C note. So a good choice here is A blues. When you play A blues, we know we have the C note in there. So if we use A blues over the first two bars, because we're using specific notes and it's always going to be that same group of 5 notes that we're using, what you're going to hear is a more harmonically defining sound because you're using a specific idea. You do hear the harmony of, or the movement and rest with the previous idea that we just did, but it just, because you're allowed to use any notes you want, it just sounds less harmonically consistent. So we've got A blues that we're going to play for 2 bars, and then we're going to go to G major 7, and at this point, it's not necessary to be on this C note immediately before you resolve it to G. Ultimately, all you need to do is play the C note at some point within the first 2 measures. So it doesn't matter when. You can play it once or you can play it 100 times within the first 2 measures as long as it's played in order to hear this movement. So I'm going to play A blues. I may or may not be on the C note as I resolve this time, but it doesn't matter which way you do it. That was just a practicing thing to make sure that you're consistently able to do this on the right beat when you need to. Okay, so here's A blues for 2 measures, and then when I get to the G major, I'll play pretty simply, probably mostly G pentatonic. Okay. So that's A blues to G pentatonic. You could also play the entire G Ionian scale over the G major if you wanted to. Just make sure you resolve the 4 should you play it when you're playing over the G major 7. So that's something you should work on. The next idea, we're going to play more from the A Dorian scale, trying to include the C note because we do want to hear the movement, and then more from the G Ionian scale. Or you can play G pentatonic. Here what I'm going to do is just start using all 7 notes. All right, so here's that. Okay, so you hear more melodic sounds because I'm using more notes. Next idea. You're going to play A blues for 2 bars, and if you think back to G Ionian, when we were practicing that scale by itself, one of the ideas we talked about is that you can use, obviously, G pentatonic, but we also talked about the fact that you can use B blues over a G major 7, and it has that open type of a sound to it. So now what I'm going to do is over the 2 and the 5 chord, I'm going to play A blues, and then over G major 7, I'm going to play nothing but B blues. All right, and I'll just do that a couple of times. Okay, one final idea. You can think similar to what we did in the beginning, where the first idea that we had was G pentatonic all the way through, so you're literally thinking a G root all the way through that progression. We're just going to expand that to including the entire G Ionian scale. Now what I want you to do is mostly play in the beginning here from the G major 7 tone center, but over the first 2 bars include the 4. This really kind of brings home the idea that this progression is revolved around the G major 7 chord. So if I play G major 7 tone center over the whole thing, but in the first 2 measures include that C note, and then come back to the G major 7 over the G major 7 chord, you'll hear what I'm talking about. So it's just another idea that you can use, and here's that one. So there's that one. All right, bunch of stuff to work on over 2/5. Later on, we can come back and talk about even more stuff, but for now, that should keep you busy.